Before modern regulation, before federal drug safety laws, a radioactive scam was sold as health. It was bottled, branded, endorsed by physicians, advertised as vitality. In the early 1920s, Americans drank radiation on purpose. They believed it strengthened bones, rejuvenated blood, restored youth. Instead, it accumulated silently. The danger was not hidden, it was misunderstood. In 1898, Marie Curie and Pierre Curie isolated radium. The discovery electrified the scientific world. Radiation appeared powerful, mysterious, invisible, energetic. Invisible forces suggested invisible benefits. By the early 20th century, radium was associated with progress. Hospitals used it experimentally. Researchers studied it intensely. Newspapers described it as modern magic. Scientific prestige created trust. Trust created opportunity. Manufacturers began embedding radium into consumer products: toothpaste, cosmetics, heating pads, health tonics. The glow implied vitality. Few understood dosage, fewer understood accumulation. Radiation was measured in curiosity, not caution. The language of science was persuasive: atomic, energy, revitalization. These words carried authority. In 1913, a product named Radithor entered the market. It was simple: distilled water infused with radium, marketed as a cure for fatigue, impotence, general weakness. It was expensive, which reinforced credibility. Exclusivity implied effectiveness. The system that allowed it was fragmented. Federal oversight was limited. Safety standards were inconsistent. Medical advertising faced little constraint. The marketplace rewarded novelty. Radium symbolized the future. The future sold. Consumers did not believe they were experimenting. They believed they were upgrading. Radiation was not framed as risk, it was framed as advancement. The body was seen as rechargeable. Radium was the charge. Early warning signs existed. Scientists observed tissue damage. Industrial workers developed unexplained illnesses. But consumer products were positioned differently: diluted, refined, safe. The distinction went largely unquestioned. Authority reinforced belief. Doctors prescribed, companies advertised, newspapers repeated claims. Trust scaled nationally. What began as laboratory discovery became commercial optimism. Optimism became ingestion. Ingested radiation does not dissipate quickly. Radium mimics calcium. It lodges in bone. It remains. The body does not negotiate with isotopes. Decay continues internally. Energy is released regardless of belief. By the time symptoms appeared, the narrative had already hardened. The radioactive cure did not collapse immediately. It expanded first. It expanded because institutions were unprepared, because science moved faster than regulation, because prestige shielded scrutiny, and because consumers trusted the language of progress. This was not a failure of chemistry alone, it was a failure of structure, a system that equated innovation with safety, and a public taught to see radiation as health, not hazard. Radium entered commerce quietly. It did not begin as mass consumption. It began as prestige. In 1898, Marie Curie and Pierre Curie isolated the element. It emitted energy continuously. That fact alone reshaped imagination. Energy without visible fuel suggested power without limit. Newspapers simplified the science. Radiation became synonymous with vitality. Hospitals experimented with radium for cancer treatment. In controlled settings, it showed measurable effects. That was enough to build confidence. Confidence spread faster than understanding. By the early 1900s, radium symbolized progress. Progress carries authority. Authority reduces doubt. Manufacturers noticed. Small quantities of radium were added to consumer goods, face creams, hair tonics, heating pads. The label radioactive became a selling point. It implied modern science inside the bottle. Few asked about dosage. Measurement standards were inconsistent. Long-term biological studies were limited. Regulation was minimal. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 required honest labeling. It did not require proof of safety or effectiveness. Claims could be broad. Words like revitalizing and energizing were persuasive. Scientific vocabulary entered advertising. Atomic, vital, restorative. Technical language created legitimacy. The glow of radium reinforced belief. Light suggested life. Consumers associated energy with strength. Strength suggested health. The logic felt linear. In reality, it was incomplete. Medical radium use was targeted. Commercial radium use was generalized. The distinction was rarely explained. Cultural conditions favored optimism. Industrial growth was visible. Medical advances were accelerating. Life expectancy was rising. Improvement seemed continuous. Radium fit the narrative. It represented the future. If the future was powerful, it must also be beneficial. Few considered accumulation. Radium mimics calcium. It integrates into bone. Decay continues internally. But those mechanisms were not widely understood, and absence of immediate symptoms reassured buyers. Trust was national. Trust in science. Trust in doctors. Trust in modern industry. The product category expanded. What began as laboratory prestige became commercial opportunity. Scientific authority had been converted into market demand. The element had crossed a boundary, from discovery to commodity. The next step would be concentration, and concentration would turn optimism into exposure. By the 1910s, radioactivity moved beyond laboratories. It entered the marketplace. The shift was simple, from external exposure to internal consumption. Liquid products dominated. Water implied purity. Purity implied safety. Entrepreneurs began selling distilled water infused with radium. The formula sounded scientific. Scientific language builds trust. Dosage was listed in microcuries. Few buyers understood the term. Numbers without context feel precise. Advertisements promised energy, improved stamina, general revitalization. The claims were vague. Vagueness protects sellers. The bottles were expensive. High cost suggested quality. Distribution focused on professionals and elites. Private physicians recommended them. Businessmen shared testimonials. Social proof accelerated demand. Some doctors believed small radiation doses stimulated biological response. The theory lacked long-term evidence, but it sounded modern. Industrial life was demanding. Fatigue was common. Stress was rising. Competition intensified. A tonic offering internal energy fit the moment. Early effects seemed mild. Users reported brief stimulation. Expectation influences perception. Positive reports reinforced belief. Radiation damage does not appear immediately. Radium chemically resembles calcium. When ingested, it settles in bone. Atomic decay continues internally. Cells absorb repeated exposure. The process is gradual. Gradual harm avoids alarm. No federal agency required extended safety trials. Toxicology standards were limited. Oversight focused on labeling, not biological impact. Manufacturers emphasized vitality. They did not discuss accumulation. Consumers trusted scientific progress. Science had delivered electricity, antiseptics, vaccines. Radiation appeared to be the next advance. The distinction between medical therapy and commercial ingestion blurred. Precision use in hospitals became generalized consumption at home. Confidence expanded faster than evidence. By the early 1920s, radioactive tonics were considered respectable. Respectability lowers skepticism. The act of drinking radiation no longer felt experimental, it felt progressive. The system had normalized exposure, and normalization would soon confront biology. One product came to define the era: Radithor. Introduced in 1918, it was marketed as a certified radioactive water. Each small glass bottle contained distilled water and measured radium isotopes. The label emphasized precision. 2 forms of radium, quantified activity, laboratory preparation. Scientific detail created authority. The manufacturer was William J. Bailey. He was not a medical doctor. He presented himself as one. Credentials were rarely verified. Radithor was priced high. High price implied exclusivity. It was sold as a remedy for fatigue, impotence, nervous disorders. These were conditions difficult to measure. Difficult to measure means difficult to disprove. Bailey framed the product as advanced therapy. Advertising referenced radioactivity as restorative. The tone was confident, modern, clinical. There were no large clinical trials. There was no federal requirement for them. The Pure Food and Drug Act addressed mislabeling. It did not evaluate long-term toxicity. Radithor spread through reputation. Some physicians recommended it. Affluent consumers adopted it. Testimonials circulated in newspapers. The product's packaging was deliberate. Small bottles, minimal design, technical language. It resembled laboratory supply, not patent medicine. That distinction mattered. Patent medicines were associated with exaggeration. Radithor positioned itself as scientific. Scientific positioning reduces suspicion. Users were instructed to take multiple bottles daily. Cumulative exposure increased quietly. Radium accumulates in bone. Decay continues over years. Damage compounds internally. The symptoms do not appear immediately. Delay creates false confidence. Bailey dismissed critics as outdated. He described radium as life-giving energy. The narrative aligned with the cultural moment. Modern science was admired. Regulation remained fragmented. No centralized authority evaluated radioactive ingestion. Market demand determined survival. Radithor prospered within that environment. It represented a shift. Radiation was no longer novelty. It was routine supplementation. And routine ingestion would soon meet a biological limit that marketing could not override. Belief did not spread by accident. It followed authority. In the early 20th century, scientists were cultural heroes. Laboratories symbolized progress. White coats signaled certainty. When a product referenced atomic research, it borrowed that authority. Consumers rarely separated discovery from application. If radium cured tumors in hospitals, it must strengthen healthy bodies at home. That logic felt consistent. The distinction between controlled therapy and daily consumption was not emphasized. Complex science was simplified. Radiation stimulates. Stimulation restores. Restoration improves life. The chain appeared rational. Fatigue was widespread. Industrial schedules intensified. Urban living accelerated. Business culture rewarded endurance. A tonic promising internal energy addressed a common anxiety. Anxiety increases receptivity. Marketing amplified reassurance. Testimonials described renewed strength, improved mood, enhanced vitality. Subjective experiences are persuasive. Placebo effects reinforce narrative. Expectation influences perception. Perception becomes evidence. Evidence becomes advertisement. Few consumers demanded longitudinal studies. Few physicians tracked cumulative exposure. Data collection was inconsistent. Regulatory agencies were limited in scope. The federal government focused on labeling accuracy, not biochemical accumulation. Risk communication lagged behind innovation. Scientific uncertainty was interpreted as safety. Absence of immediate harm suggested harmlessness. Gradual damage rarely alarms early adopters. Radium's invisibility added to confidence. There was no immediate pain, no instant collapse, no dramatic reaction. Internal decay is silent. Silence supports belief. The economic incentives were aligned. Manufacturers profited from optimism. Retailers benefited from demand. Doctors gained modern credibility. No single actor carried full responsibility. The structure rewarded participation. By the mid-1920s, radioactive tonics were embedded in elite circles. Country club endorsements normalized use. Business leaders adopted them publicly. Status accelerated diffusion. The system reinforced itself. Scientific prestige, cultural trust, commercial profit. Each element strengthened the other. Belief was not irrational. It was structured. Structured trust is difficult to reverse, and reversal would require evidence too visible to ignore. The first major warning did not come from regulators. It came from a customer. Eben Byers was a wealthy American industrialist. In 1927, he injured his arm. A physician recommended Radithor. Byers began drinking it daily. At first, he reported improvement. Energy increased. Pain seemed reduced. He continued the routine, multiple bottles per day, for years. Radium accumulates in bone. Decay continues internally. Damage compounds silently. By 1930, Byers' health began to collapse. Teeth loosened. Jaw pain intensified. Weight declined. Doctors were confused. Symptoms did not resemble common illness. Bone tissue deteriorated. Necrosis developed. Sections of his jaw were surgically removed. The condition worsened. Radiation poisoning was suspected. By 1932, Eben Byers was dead. The case attracted national attention. He was not anonymous. He was prominent. Status changed the scale of scrutiny. Newspapers reported the details. The phrase radium jaw entered public language. For the first time, radioactive tonics were linked directly to fatal harm. The narrative shifted. Energy became exposure. Vitality became decay. Radithor's image fractured. William J. A. Bailey dismissed responsibility. He defended dosage levels. He cited scientific uncertainty. But the evidence was visible. Bone destruction is difficult to ignore. Byers' death forced institutions to respond. The Federal Trade Commission initiated investigation. Regulatory pressure increased. The product was eventually removed from the market. The collapse was not immediate, but credibility was damaged. The system that had normalized ingestion now faced undeniable consequence. A single high-profile death exposed a structural failure. Innovation had advanced faster than oversight, and biology had delivered a verdict that marketing could not reverse.
Eben Byers was not the first to suffer. He was the first widely reported. Years earlier, another group had already been exposed. They were factory workers, young women employed to paint watch dials. The material was luminous, radium mixed with zinc sulfide. The paint glowed in the dark. The product symbolized modern precision, time made visible at night. To sharpen their brushes, workers were instructed to point the tips with their lips. Lip, dip, paint. The motion was repeated hundreds of times per day. Supervisors assured them the substance was safe. Some managers even handled it casually to demonstrate confidence. The women absorbed small amounts daily. Radium entered their bodies gradually. As with the tonics, the damage was cumulative. Jaw pain appeared first. Teeth loosened. Gums deteriorated. Bone tissue weakened. Doctors misdiagnosed early cases. Symptoms were attributed to infection. In reality, radium had settled in bone. Decay continued internally. By the early 1920s, multiple workers were seriously ill. Some died. The cases did not receive national attention immediately. The women lacked wealth and influence. Companies denied responsibility. Corporate physicians suggested alternative causes. Blame was redirected. Evidence was questioned. Litigation was slow. Scientific certainty was incomplete. Delay favored employers. Over time, patterns became undeniable. Multiple workers from the same facilities displayed similar symptoms: bone necrosis, anemia, severe structural damage. The condition became known as radium jaw. Unlike Radithor consumers, these women had not chosen ingestion. Exposure was occupational. The contrast exposed a broader issue. Radium was not only a consumer hazard, it was an industrial one. The problem was systemic. Production standards were minimal. Protective equipment was absent. Long-term monitoring did not exist. Profit incentives outweighed precaution. By the late 1920s, lawsuits forced public examination. Testimony described visible deterioration. Public sympathy grew. The narrative shifted again. Radiation was no longer modern vitality. It was measurable harm. The same element sold as rejuvenation was destroying workers. Two different markets, one shared mechanism: accumulation. The consequences were no longer isolated cases. They were structural evidence. And structural evidence demands institutional response.
Public exposure did not immediately end the market. It reshaped the argument. Manufacturers shifted language. Benefits became cautious. Claims became indirect. The word cure appeared less often. The word revitalizing remained. Ambiguity protects survival. Newspaper coverage intensified after 1932. Byers' death was widely reported. The Radium Girls lawsuits gained attention. Radiation entered public debate. But debate does not equal reform. Regulatory authority was still limited. The Federal Trade Commission could challenge advertising. It could not impose comprehensive safety standards. Scientific agencies studied exposure, but enforcement mechanisms were fragmented. Companies emphasized dosage differences. They argued that therapeutic levels were safe. They cited incomplete data. Uncertainty became defense. The economic structure resisted collapse. Inventories remained. Distribution networks persisted. Consumers still believed. Belief erodes slowly, especially when prior trust was strong. However, public perception had shifted. Radium was no longer pure progress. It carried risk. Retailers began distancing themselves. Physicians reconsidered recommendations. Insurance concerns increased. Liability alters calculation. The cost of endorsement rose. Gradually, sales declined, not through dramatic prohibition, through erosion. Reputation deteriorated. Confidence weakened. Demand contracted. The market shrank before law fully intervened. But reform required more than market correction. It required structural change. The absence of centralized drug oversight had enabled rapid commercialization. Scientific discovery had outpaced governance. By the mid-1930s, federal policymakers were reassessing regulatory gaps. Public health demanded clearer authority. The radioactive tonic episode had revealed limitations. Labeling alone was insufficient. Voluntary compliance was unreliable. Corporate self-policing was inadequate. The lesson was procedural. Innovation requires oversight. Without it, risk disperses faster than responsibility. The decline of radioactive health products marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of stronger federal intervention in medicine. The system was preparing to adjust. An adjustment would redefine the relationship between science, commerce, and the body. Reform did not begin with panic. It began with accumulation of failure. By the mid-1930s, the federal government faced mounting evidence that existing laws were inadequate. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 focused on labeling accuracy. It did not require proof of safety. It did not mandate pre-market testing. Radioactive tonics had exposed that weakness. So had other dangerous products. In 1937, a separate tragedy accelerated change. A drug called elixir sulfanilamide, dissolved in toxic solvent, killed more than 100 people. The event shocked the nation. It demonstrated the cost of reactive regulation. Congress responded in 1938. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act expanded federal authority. For the first time, manufacturers were required to demonstrate safety before marketing new drugs. Pre-market review became standard. Inspection powers increased. False therapeutic claims faced stronger scrutiny. The radioactive cure era had contributed to this shift. It illustrated the limits of voluntary restraint. It showed how prestige could shield risk. It revealed how cumulative harm escapes early detection. Regulation became more centralized. The Food and Drug Administration gained stronger enforcement tools. Scientific evaluation was formalized. Toxicology standards improved. Measurement replaced assumption. The transition was not immediate perfection, but it marked structural correction. The body was no longer treated as experimental terrain. Innovation required documentation. Claims required evidence. Safety required demonstration. The marketplace adjusted. Miracle tonics declined. Overt radioactive products disappeared. Public trust recalibrated. Science remained respected, but respect became conditional. The system had learned. Discovery alone was insufficient. Commercial enthusiasm required constraint. The radioactive cure did not end scientific optimism. It redefined its boundaries. Progress would continue, but now progress required oversight, and oversight would become permanent. Regulation changed procedure. It did not erase memory. By the 1940s, radioactive health products had largely disappeared, but the psychological pattern remained. Scientific discovery generates excitement. Excitement invites commercialization. Commercialization precedes full understanding. The cycle is repeatable. The radioactive era demonstrated a structural dynamic. Prestige lowers skepticism. Complex language reduces scrutiny. Delayed harm sustains belief. Cumulative risk avoids early detection. These conditions are not unique to radium. They appear whenever innovation outruns oversight. The early 20th century trusted progress deeply. Industrial growth had delivered tangible improvement. Electric light replaced gas lamps. Antibiotics reduced infection. Transportation accelerated mobility. Each success reinforced faith in science. Radium fit that narrative. It promised internal modernization. When harm appeared, it appeared gradually. Gradual collapse complicates accountability. No single bottle caused immediate catastrophe. Exposure accumulated over time. Responsibility dispersed across actors. Manufacturers produced. Doctors recommended. Consumers ingested. Regulators observed. Distributed responsibility delays reform. The lesson was institutional. Oversight must anticipate enthusiasm. Safety cannot rely on absence of visible damage. Scientific authority must be separated from marketing language. These adjustments reshaped medicine. Clinical trials became structured. Dosage evaluation improved. Long-term monitoring expanded. The body was reframed, not as a site for experimentation, but as a protected system. Public trust shifted from blind confidence to conditional approval. Evidence became prerequisite. The radioactive cure did not end belief in innovation, it narrowed its pathway. Modern pharmaceutical regulation traces part of its logic to that earlier failure. Radium revealed the cost of assumption. It demonstrated that invisible forces require visible safeguards. The system adapted. But adaptation followed harm, and structural learning often arrives after irreversible exposure. The radioactive cure did not vanish into obscurity. It became precedent. Regulators cited it when drafting new standards. Scientists referenced it in toxicology research. Lawmakers recalled it during debates over consumer protection. The episode reshaped how risk was measured. Dose became central, duration became critical, accumulation became calculable. Radium's behavior in bone forced a deeper understanding of internal exposure. Biological half-life entered discussion. Long-term decay required long-term study. Medicine shifted toward controlled experimentation. Randomized trials gained prominence. Statistical evaluation replaced testimonial evidence. Marketing language lost autonomy. Claims required documentation. Documentation required review. The boundary between laboratory discovery and retail application hardened. Professional licensing tightened. Medical credentials faced greater verification. Advertising to physicians was scrutinized more closely. The system did not become flawless, but it became more resistant to novelty. The radioactive era also altered public perception. Consumers became more cautious about products labeled as revolutionary. The word radioactive lost its commercial appeal. It became associated with hazard, not vitality. Language can reverse meaning. Energy became exposure. Glow became warning. The transformation was cultural as well as legal. Educational campaigns expanded. Public health communication improved. Scientific literacy increased gradually. The event reinforced a principle. Innovation without constraint creates hidden liabilities. Constraint without innovation stalls progress. Balance requires structure. Structure requires authority. Authority requires accountability. The radioactive cure demonstrated how quickly imbalance emerges. It also demonstrated how slowly correction occurs. Reform followed damage. Policy followed pathology. The system learned through consequence, and that lesson would echo whenever the next miracle substance entered the market. By the late 1930s, radioactive health products had nearly disappeared, not through sudden prohibition, through erosion of credibility. Scientific reassessment expanded. Researchers measured radium's long-term behavior in bone. Biological half-life became central. Accumulation replaced speculation. Hospitals refined therapeutic radiation under controlled conditions. Dose was limited. Application was targeted. Monitoring increased. The distinction between medicine and marketing hardened. The public adjusted slowly. The word radioactive lost commercial appeal. It no longer implied vitality, it implied danger. Language had reversed. Manufacturers retreated from overt radiation branding. Inventories were withdrawn. Advertisements faded. Distribution contracts ended. The market corrected before full regulatory maturity. But correction did not erase consequence. The Radium Girls' lawsuits continued. Compensation cases set precedent. Occupational safety standards improved gradually. Workplace exposure monitoring increased. Protective equipment became standard in hazardous industries. Scientific prestige was recalibrated. Discovery remained respected, but respect required verification. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 formalized pre-market safety review. Documentation became mandatory. Evidence replaced assumption. Clinical trials expanded in structure and duration. Medical authority became procedural, not promotional. The radioactive cure episode reshaped boundaries. Innovation would continue, but commercialization required oversight. The body was no longer presumed resilient to novelty. Risk assessment entered mainstream policy. Public trust shifted from enthusiasm to conditional acceptance. The system did not eliminate future failure, but it narrowed the pathway. The radioactive era ended quietly. Its influence did not. It left behind regulatory architecture. It left behind toxicology frameworks, and it left behind a permanent lesson. Invisible forces require visible safeguards. The radioactive cure did not remain a historical anomaly. It became a reference point. When new miracle substances emerged, regulators remembered radium. When marketing promised rejuvenation, lawmakers cited earlier failure. The episode shaped institutional reflex. Safety review became procedural, not optional. Pre-market testing expanded. Long-term toxicity studies gained priority. Pharmaceutical approval timelines lengthened. Delay became protection. Corporate claims faced structured evaluation. Scientific authority could no longer be borrowed casually. Credentials required verification. Advertising language narrowed. Cure demanded proof. Therapeutic required documentation. The boundary between experiment and commerce hardened. The body became a regulated space, not a speculative one. Occupational safety law evolved as well. Industrial exposure limits were formalized. Radiation handling standards tightened. Monitoring equipment became routine. The Radium Girls litigation influenced compensation law. Worker protection gained precedent. The lesson extended beyond radiation. It applied to chemistry, biology, pharmacology. Innovation must be separated from enthusiasm. Enthusiasm must be restrained by evidence. The radioactive era also altered public behavior. Consumers grew more cautious toward revolutionary health claims. Scientific progress remained respected, but respect became conditional. Evidence became expectation. The shift was subtle. Trust did not disappear. It matured. The system absorbed the failure. It redesigned procedure. It institutionalized skepticism. Radium was no longer a tonic. It became a warning, not against science, but against unexamined acceleration. Progress continued, but it moved within structure, and structure became the enduring legacy of a cure that once promised vitality and delivered exposure. The radioactive cure belongs to the early 20th century. Its pattern does not. New substances continue to enter the market with scientific language and optimistic framing. The terminology changes. The structure remains familiar. A breakthrough is announced. Preliminary studies show promise. Media coverage simplifies findings. Entrepreneurs translate complexity into products. Consumers purchase possibility. In the 1950s and 1960s, vitamin megadoses were promoted as universal solutions. In the late 20th century, hormone therapies were widely prescribed before long-term risks were fully mapped. In the 21st century, supplement industries operate with lighter oversight than prescription pharmaceuticals. Terms like natural, detox, and biohacking signal advancement. Scientific vocabulary still functions as marketing capital. Preclinical research is often cited. Longitudinal data may be limited. Regulatory categories differ. Dietary supplements in the United States, for example, do not require the same pre-market approval as prescription drugs. The structure resembles the earlier imbalance. Innovation generates demand. Demand pressures commercialization. Commercialization precedes comprehensive evidence. The lesson of radium is not that science fails. It is that timing matters. Evidence must lead expansion, not follow harm. When enthusiasm outruns evaluation, risk compounds quietly. Modern regulatory systems are stronger, but economic incentives remain powerful. Profit rewards speed. Safety requires delay. That tension persists. The radioactive era demonstrates the cost of resolving that tension in favor of acceleration. Invisible harm accumulates before visible reform arrives. The names change, the mechanisms do not. Authority persuades, markets amplify, biology responds. The pattern is cyclical, which is why the radioactive cure remains relevant, not as an isolated mistake, but as a structural example. Progress requires structure. Without structure, progress becomes exposure. The radioactive cure was not simply a dangerous product. It was a systems event. A scientific breakthrough entered a marketplace that lacked synchronized oversight. Prestige substituted for proof. Confidence replaced caution. Radiation was invisible. Its damage was cumulative. Cumulative harm evades immediate detection. That delay allowed expansion. Expansion generated revenue. Revenue reinforced belief. Belief suppressed skepticism. No single actor engineered catastrophe. Researchers pursued discovery. Entrepreneurs pursued opportunity. Doctors pursued innovation. Consumers pursued vitality. Regulators operated within limited authority. The failure was structural. Innovation moved faster than governance. Governance adjusted only after consequence. Radium did not deceive through secrecy. Its properties were documented. Its risks were incompletely understood. The gap between understanding and application proved decisive. When discovery enters commerce, evidence must precede scale. If scale precedes evidence, harm distributes before correction. The radioactive era forced that recognition. Regulatory architecture strengthened. Scientific review formalized. Occupational protections expanded. Public trust recalibrated. But recalibration followed exposure. The lesson endures. Scientific authority carries persuasive power. Persuasive power attracts profit. Profit accelerates distribution. Distribution magnifies uncertainty. Without structural counterweight, uncertainty becomes damage. Radium once symbolized the future. It later symbolized hazard. The element did not change. The system did. That shift defines the legacy. Innovation remains essential, but innovation requires constraint. Invisible forces require visible safeguards, and every generation must decide whether enthusiasm or structure will lead first.